Kabul Cantonment, January 5, 1842. Inside a mud-walled compound built for a garrison at peace, not a garrison under siege, Major General William Elphinstone sits with a map he can no longer trust and a treaty he cannot enforce. Outside the walls, snow is already a foot deep and falling. Inside, 16,000 people, soldiers, wives, children, cooks, grooms, merchants, are packing for a 90-mile march through mountain passes controlled by men who, 3 weeks earlier, murdered the British envoy and hung his body in the bazaar. Elphinstone has just signed off on a promise of safe conduct from the very man responsible for that murder. He believes, or has convinced himself he believes, that it will hold. It will not hold for even a single full day. This is the story of how an entire British field army, not a detachment, not a garrison, an army, walked out of a city under a flag of truce and, within 1 week, ceased to exist. The question worth answering is not whether this could happen. It's how a force that size, in a country the British had already occupied for 2 years, failed to see it coming until it was standing in the middle of it. Zoom out first, because none of this makes sense without the bigger board it was played on. By 1839, the British East India Company had spent the better part of a decade watching Russia's slow expansion through Central Asia with something close to institutional panic. The rivalry historians would later nickname the Great Game, a shadow war for influence stretching from the Caucasus to the Himalayas, fought mostly with spies, subsidies, and bluff rather than open battle. Afghanistan sat directly across the route any Russian force would need to take toward British India, and its ruler, Dost Mohammad Khan, had made the mistake of receiving a Russian agent politely. That was enough. The Governor-General of India, Lord Auckland, decided Dost Mohammad had to go, and that Shah Shuja, a former Afghan king who had been out of power for nearly 30 years and had essentially no independent base of support left in the country, should be restored to the throne with British bayonets standing behind him. The invasion that followed, in 1839, was fast and looked, on the surface, like a triumph. Kandahar fell without resistance. The fortress at Ghazni was stormed and taken in a single assault. Kabul was occupied within months, Shah Shuja was crowned, and Dost Mohammad was shipped off into a comfortable Indian exile. The British garrison that stayed behind to prop up their new king settled into occupied Kabul the way an army settles in when it has stopped expecting a fight. Officers sent for their families, there were amateur theatricals, there was skating on a frozen pond outside the cantonment walls in winter. The cantonment itself, the fortified camp where the garrison actually lived, had been built on flat, open, easily overlooked ground rather than a defensible position, because flat ground was convenient and nobody senior thought defense would ever matter. 2 men, in particular, are worth knowing before this story turns, because their personalities decide almost everything that follows. The first is Elphinstone himself. He was 60 years old when he took command in Kabul, a genuine Waterloo veteran with real distinction from a war fought 27 years earlier, and by 1841 a man so crippled by gout that he sometimes had to be lifted onto his horse. He had written privately, before ever taking up the post, that he doubted his own fitness for it. He took the command regardless, because in the company's army seniority decided these things far more than ability, and turning down a post you'd been offered simply wasn't done by an officer of his generation and rank. That single trait, an old soldier too dutiful, or too proud, to say no to a job he knew he couldn't do, is the hinge this entire disaster turns on. Every fatal delay, every order given and then reversed within the hour, every moment where decisive action was needed and a committee meeting happened instead, traces back to that one refusal to refuse. The second is Sir William Macnaghten, the British envoy in Kabul, brilliant, fluent in Persian, and catastrophically overconfident, a man who kept reporting Afghanistan pacified straight through the autumn of 1841 even as the tribes around the city rearmed and the subsidies that had been buying their cooperation ran dry. And waiting in the wings, the man the British consistently underestimated until it was too late to matter, Wazir Akbar Khan, son of the exiled Dost Mohammad, young, capable, and personally furious at watching a foreign garrison occupy his father's capital. The decision that sealed everything came in stages, and the first stage was a massacre nobody in the cantonment answered. On November 2, 1841, a mob in Kabul attacked and killed Sir Alexander Burnes, a senior British political officer, along with his brother and his guards, in a house barely a mile and a half from the main garrison. The garrison did not move. Not that morning, not that week. That single failure to respond told every faction watching, the tribes, the city, Akbar Khan himself, that the British force in Kabul would absorb violence without answering it, and the uprising spread from there, cutting the garrison's supply lines and picking off outposts in a string of skirmishes the British kept losing. Macnaghten, still certain he could negotiate his way out, arranged a personal parley with Akbar Khan on December 23, 1841. He brought pistols to the meeting, apparently believing that gave him the advantage. Akbar Khan seized him mid-negotiation and killed him with his own weapon, then had the body mutilated and put on display in the bazaar. Britain's senior political authority in Afghanistan was dead, and the man now responsible for either fighting on or getting 16,000 people out alive was a 60-year-old general who could barely stand without help. What followed was 3 weeks of negotiation between Elphinstone's remaining political officer, Major Eldred Pottinger, wounded, and effectively drafted into a job nobody else wanted, and the very man who had just murdered Britain's envoy. Akbar Khan offered terms, safe passage to Jalalabad, provisions along the way, escorts, in exchange for Kabul's complete evacuation and the surrender of most of the garrison's heavy guns and treasury. Pottinger argued hard against it. Hold the cantonment. Force passage on British terms, with the guns intact, rather than surrender the one thing giving the column any leverage at all. He was overruled. On January 6, 1842, the entire British and company force filed out of Kabul's gates and started east, roughly 4,500 soldiers and close to 12,000 camp followers, walking into mountain passes in the depth of the Afghan winter, trusting the word of the man who had killed their envoy 2 weeks before. Now the story becomes a matter of hours and miles, and the details are worth sitting with, because this collapse did not happen all at once. It happened in stages, each one predictable from the last, each one ignored until it was too late to correct. The column left 3 hours behind its planned departure, the delay caused by the sheer logistics of moving 12,000 civilians and their belongings out of a single gate, which meant the rear of the march was still exposed on open ground as darkness fell on the first day. Snow lay roughly 18 inches deep on the road. Many of the sepoys, soldiers of the Bengal army recruited from the plains of India, had no winter clothing whatsoever, and camp followers began dying of exposure within the column's first few miles, before a single Afghan musket had fired a shot. By the second day, tribesmen, not necessarily under Akbar Khan's direct control, and that distinction matters, because his promised safe conduct meant very little against independent Ghilzai fighters who answered to nobody but their own chiefs, began firing into the column from the high ground on either side of the road. Their Jazales, the long Afghan hunting rifles, outranged the British muskets trying to answer from the valley floor below. Brigadier John Shelton, commanding the rearguard, fought a running defensive action for most of the march, but every mile cost men, animals, and what remained of discipline. On January 8 the column entered the Khoord Kabul Pass, a 5-mile defile walled by cliffs hundreds of feet high, narrow enough in places to force the column into single file. Afghan marksmen held the heights the entire length of it. What happened inside that gorge over the following hours was not a battle in any recognizable sense, it was a massacre in a shoot, with an estimated 3,000 soldiers and civilians killed before the column cleared the far end. Survivors described the river running through the pass as visibly red by the time they reached its mouth. Shift the view for a moment to the other side of that ridgeline, because the dramatic irony here deserves to be noticed. Akbar Khan rode alongside sections of the retreating column for stretches of the march, telling Elphinstone directly that he was doing everything in his power to restrain the tribes and protect British lives. He took hostages for their safety, including several officers' wives, among them Lady Florentia Sale, 50 years old, wounded in the wrist by a musket ball during the Khoord Kabul fighting, who kept a diary of the entire ordeal in a tone so dry and unbothered it reads more like a woman annoyed at a delayed train than one walking through a massacre. She would survive. Remember her. Her fate is one of the strange bright threads running through an otherwise total catastrophe. Whether Akbar Khan's professed concern for the column was genuine, calculated leverage, or some mixture of both is still argued over by historians today. What isn't argued is that he did nothing to stop the killing in the passes, and everything to keep the British dependent on his continued goodwill while it happened around them. By January 11th, 5 days into a march meant to take roughly a week, the 12,000 camp followers who had left Kabul had been reduced to a small fraction of that number, dead from cold, from tribal attack, or simply left behind because they could no longer walk. Soldiers abandoned their own weapons to carry frostbitten children. Sepoys, starving, refused direct orders to keep moving. And Elphinstone, riding near the column's center, kept sending instructions to Shelton's rearguard that contradicted the orders he'd sent an hour earlier, until Shelton later admitted he'd stopped trusting any command that didn't arrive with the general physically present to confirm it. Watch closely what happens next at Jugdaluk, because the exact pattern that destroys this army repeats itself there almost move for move, narrow gorge, high ground already in enemy hands, a barrier across the road nobody scouted in advance. And once you see that pattern once, you'll recognize it in nearly every disaster this channel covers. Worth subscribing for, if that's the kind of detail you want to keep catching. On January 12th, what remained of the column, a few hundred fighting men and a shrinking crowd of civilians, reached the Jugdaluk Pass and found the road blocked by a barricade of hollyoak branches the Ghilzai had built across the gorge specifically to trap them there. Afghan fighters held both slopes above it. The column tried to force the barricade after dark, in the confusion, in the cold, and those who broke through kept moving east through the night with no food and no proper clothing, in temperatures low enough that men who stopped to rest simply froze where they sat a day. By dawn on January 13th, what had been an army of 16,000 a week earlier had been reduced to roughly 20 officers and 45 soldiers, most of them from Her Majesty's 44th Regiment of Foot, along with a scattering of remaining civilians. They reached the village of Gandamak, still more than 30 miles from safety, out of food, nearly out of ammunition, most men down to a handful of rounds each. Afghan fighters surrounded the low hill above the village and called for surrender. The 44th refused. Captain Thomas Souter reportedly wound the regiment's colors around his own body under his coat, so they couldn't be taken as a trophy if he fell. Men fixed bayonets to muskets that had nothing left to fire. Then it started. Volleys from the high ground into a square with almost no ammunition to answer them with. Bayonets against long Afghan knives, at point-blank range, on frozen ground. Fewer than a dozen men still standing within the hour. Most of the men on that hillside died there that morning. A small handful, including Souter, whose officer's coat apparently marked him as worth keeping alive for ransom, were taken prisoner instead of killed. Of the 16,000-odd people who had left Kabul 7 days earlier, one man reached the walls of Jalalabad under his own power. Assistant Surgeon William Bryden, riding a dying pony, part of his skull exposed where a sword cut had partly been deflected by a magazine tucked inside his hat, staggered to the gate the garrison had been watching for days, waiting for the relief column to arrive. State the numbers plainly, because they don't need decoration. Roughly 4,500 soldiers and 12,000 camp followers left Kabul on January 6, 1842. In the 7 days that followed, the overwhelming majority were killed in the passes or died of exposure. A small number, mostly officers, wives, and children, including Lady Sale, survived as hostages and were released months later. One soldier walked into Jalalabad on his own strength. 16,000 to 1 is not a metaphor here. It's the actual ratio. The story doesn't end at that gate, though, because the shockwave from this single week traveled a long way past Afghanistan. The destruction of the Kabul garrison was the worst military disaster the British Empire had suffered up to that point in the 19th century, and the political fallout in London and Calcutta moved almost as fast as the disaster itself. Lord Auckland, whose Afghan policy had started the whole war, was recalled in disgrace. His replacement, Lord Ellenborough, authorized a punitive force that became known as the Army of Retribution, under Generals George Pollock and William Knott, which fought back through the same passes later in 1842, relieved the besieged garrison still holding Jalalabad, retook Kabul that September, recovered the surviving hostages, and burned Kabul's Great Bazaar to the ground as a deliberate act of reprisal before withdrawing from the country entirely. Britain never attempted to hold Kabul again after 1842. Dost Mohammed Khan, the ruler the entire war had originally been fought to remove, was quietly released from his comfortable Indian exile and restored to his own throne, which meant that after 3 years of war and the near-total destruction of a field army, Afghanistan's government ended up exactly where it had started before the invasion. The larger lesson, that the country could be entered but not easily held, went largely unlearned by the powers that tried the same thing in the decades and generations that followed. Wide symbolic shot of an aging Afghan ruler being ceremonially reseated on a modest throne inside a restored Kabul Palace hall, attendants bowing, soft warm light streaming through high windows, faint ironic calm after chaos, empty space where British officers once stood now vacant, desaturated gold and brown palette, cinematic composition, documentary historical realism, fine grain, subtle vignette R16:9, V6.0 style raw. Major General William Elphinstone surrendered himself into Akbar Khan's custody partway through the retreat, hoping his own captivity might spare the rest of the column further attack. It did not meaningfully help. He died a prisoner in April 1842, still holding the rank of the general who had presided over the destruction of his own command, a command he had told a friend, in writing, before it ever began, that he doubted he was fit to hold. Wazir Akbar Khan kept fighting the British occupation through 1842, negotiated his hostages' release later that year as the army of retribution closed in, and became a powerful figure in his restored father's government after the British withdrawal. He died in 1847, reportedly poisoned, without ever having to answer to anyone but history for Gandamak. Major Eldred Pottinger, the one senior officer who had argued correctly, from the start, against trusting Akbar Khan's safe conduct, survived the retreat as a hostage, was released later in 1842, and died at 32 of typhus in Hong Kong the following year, having outlived by barely 12 months the disaster he'd predicted almost exactly. Lady Florentia Sale survived her captivity, was freed in September 1842, published her diary of the march and the months that followed to considerable fame back home, and lived another decade before dying in South Africa in 1853, the same flat, dry voice from her diary reportedly intact right to the end. Captain Thomas Souter, colours still wrapped around his body, survived captivity and was released later that year with the flag he'd protected still in his possession. He lived until 1888. William Brydon, the one soldier who reached Jalalabad, recovered from his wounds and stayed in the Indian Army, and was still serving 15 years later when he found himself inside the besieged residency at Lucknow during the Indian Mutiny of 1857, wounded there a second time. He survived that as well, retired to Scotland, and died quietly in 1873, having twice walked away from sieges that killed almost everyone standing near him. Here is the thing worth carrying out of this story. An empire that measured itself by discipline and overwhelming force was undone in a single week, not by a larger army, but by a mountain winter, a road nobody had properly scouted, and one old general who knew, in writing, before it started, that he shouldn't take the command, and took it anyway. The road between Kabul and Jalalabad is still there. Herders still move flocks through the Khoord Kabul Gorge most springs, over ground that swallowed 3,000 people in an afternoon, and most of them walk through without knowing it. If stories like this, the ones that get compressed into a single paragraph in most textbooks, are what you come to this channel for, subscribe, and hit like if you want more of them. And tell me in the comments, given that Pottinger argued, correctly as it turned out, for holding the cantonment and forcing passage on British terms rather than trusting Akbar Khan's word, do you think that army survives if Elphinstone overrules him and fights instead of retreats? Or was this force already beyond saving the moment Macnaghten walked into that meeting on December 23rd?